Good morning, seventh grade. We're meeting back together again to continue reading from the novel Across 5 Aprils by Irene Hunt. Today we're going to be starting chapter 6. I believe that chapter will probably end up taking us 2 lessons. Let's take a look at the questions that go along with chapter 6. And we see there are 9 questions. It's a longer chapter. And if you liked chapter 5, I think chapter 6 is even more exciting as we get into even more conflict within Jethro's own life. So let's look at question 1 says, what was wrong with Matt? 2, why did Ellen think she was a soft mother? 3, why did Jethro say he had left his childhood behind him in that March of 1862? 4, why did Jenny think that Jethro and Shad were alike? 5, why was Jethro angry with Jenny? 6, how did Jenny try to comfort Jethro about the letter? 7, what warning did the men on horseback bring in the middle of the night? 8, what was the feeling of the community towards the Creightons? And 9, what happened to the Creighton's barn? So I'm sure you're able to make some predictions, and although I said we probably won't get through all 9 questions today, we took a peek at those to be thinking about what could happen in this chapter. All right, let's turn in our books, which you should have by now, to chapter 6, which is on page 90. Read along with me, please. Matt did not sleep the night after Jethro's return from Newton, and the next morning he was up at dawn, moving aimlessly about the cabin and out and around the dooryard and woodlot. Ellen had managed to sleep a little in the early morning hours, but she got up when she heard him and prepared a breakfast that neither of them wanted. They drank a little coffee and looked at one another in silence. She noticed that his face was pale, but so was the dim light in the cabin, and so she supposed was her own face. A moment later, though, a frown came between her eyes as she watched the trembling hand place his cup back in its saucer. "You are ailing, Matt," she said quietly. "Why don't you get back to bed and rest a little? There ain't so much that needs doing this morning." He shook his head. "If you ask me, am I afraid? The answer is yes. Ailing is no, meaning you're sick, ailing." He pushed his chair back from the table a little. "I think I'll go over and ask Turner to drive to Newton with me this morning. I want to talk to him and to some of the men down there, as knows this workman." So the whole situation that happened in Newton is bothering him. "Will you stop at Birdhouse, Matt?" she asked tensely. His fingers clutched at strands of his beard as if it were necessary to hold on to something. "You'd have me do it, wouldn't you?" She nodded. "We've held it against him that his boy snuck a knife in our hearts. Now he's grabbed a second knife that was aimed at us." "Mother," he turned toward her with eyes full of despair, "if you could have known back in 1830 of all the griefs you'd have..." She put a hand out to him quickly when he paused. "Your spirit needs bolstering today, old man," she smiled at him. "You know good and well I wouldn't have believed any prophecy, and if I had, I reckon I'd have risked it. I wanted Matt Creighton for mine awful bad, if you are a mind to remember." They were silent again, each of them preoccupied and troubled. Upstairs, they heard Jenny in her room getting dressed to come down to the kitchen. There was no sound from Jethro's room. "Let the boy sleep," Matt said after a minute. "Yesterday was too much for a lad of his years." "I'm glad that you are willing," she answered. "I don't want to be a soft mother because he's my last, but it would hurt me to deny him his rest this morning." So why does she think she's soft? Think about that. So I know that I'm accused of this, having 4 children. I was pretty strict with my oldest, and now my youngest, especially as we're home, she kind of does whatever she wants. I'm a lot more lenient with each child going down. So that's kind of the same thing as being soft. Jethro being her youngest, she feels like, oh, maybe I'm being too lenient, too soft with him. And in this case, because she wants to let him sleep in, and because he's her youngest. Okay, We're right here. They got to their feet, and Ellen began to gather up their cups and saucers while Matt pulled on his jacket and cap. I aim to walk over to Ed's now, he said, and she nodded absently. A minute or two later, she thought she heard a noise at the gate, and hurrying out, she found him lying unconscious on the ground with one hand clutching at his left side. She covered him with heavy comforters while Jenny ran to Ed Turner's for help. Then, between them, they got Matt to his bed while the Turner's oldest boy drove over to Hidalgo for the doctor. So let's pause for a minute. And what is it that is wrong with Matt? So that question is actually asking about this physical ailment. It's not all of these other things that are bothering him. Ellen had noticed he was pale and he was trembling, and then he passes out and is clutching at his left side. In the answer key, it actually gives us two different possibilities at two different times. We're not sure which one, but it's definitely one of these two things. It could be, did you come up with something? He may have had a heart attack. You could put that, I'll count that as a correct answer. Or if we think about that trembling that we saw earlier, it could have been a stroke. And even at that time, they might not be fully sure. I'm going to lean more towards a stroke simply because how it affects him through the rest of the book. So either one of those are fine, but clearly he is ill. He is ailing. All right, we'll look at the bottom of the page here. Matt revived, but the vigorous, erect Matt Creighton was gone. A man who looked 20 years older had taken his place. If someone had asked Jethro to name a time when he left childhood behind him, he might have named that week of March in 1862. He had learned a great deal about men and their unpredictable behavior the day he drove alone to Newton. Now he was to learn what it meant to be the man of a family at 10. He had worked since he could remember, but his work had been done at the side of some older member of the family. When he had grown tired, he was encouraged to rest, or sometimes he was dismissed from the task altogether. Now he was to know labor from dawn till sunset. He was to learn what it meant to scan the skies for rain while corn burned in the fields, or to see a heavy rainstorm lash grain from full, strong wheat stalks, or to know that hay desperately needed for winter feeding lay rotting in a wet quagmire of a field. So we see the answer of when he left his boyhood behind. We get a very specific date, and then the reasons why. Part of it was that trip to Newton, that was his first task at manhood, but now with his father being sick and all of his older brothers away at war, he's the only boy, now man, left to take care of the farm. And there's no getting out of it. He needs to do those chores if they want to eat and they want to live. It's not like today where you can just go to the grocery store. So, I mean, they can go to the grocery store, but they also have to work for their living on the farm. By the second week of April that year, the fields were dry enough for plowing, and Jethro, full of the optimism of inexperience, harnessed his team and went out to the field alone. Ed Turner, driving past on his way home from town, stopped and waited until Jethro could get from midfield up to the fence row. "You can count on me for whatever help I can spare, Jeth, and whatever counsel. You are young for what's ahead, and I don't like to see a boy made a man too soon. I reckon, though, that it was right you'd be the staff of your pa's old age." Jethro flushed, proud and embarrassed at the same time. "I reckon I can manage," he said in his slow way. Ed hesitated and then pointed to the newspaper on the seat beside him. "There's been a bad fight, Jeth, down in South Tennessee." "Grant's army?" Jethro asked quickly. Ed nodded. "At a place they call Pittsburgh Landing, somewhere down on the Tennessee River. Grant let himself get surprised by the Rebs. Papers say that it was Sherman and Buell as saved things. They say it was a victory for us, but they're down on Grant. Make it sound like he's next of kin to Jeff Davis. So remember that two Jefferson Davises, And the one they're referring to here would be the president of the Confederacy. 2 months ago, they was yelling and praising him to the skies after Donelson. I know, it's a sight easier to be a general in a newspaper office, I reckon, than it is to be one out on a battlefield. I'm not losing my feeling for old Grant. Not yet, I ain't. Okay, I'm gonna stop the share. We got my map behind me, so let's take a peek here. I pulled this up on purpose. So once again, we have Southern Illinois, where our story takes place. We move south into Kentucky, where Will Scram is from. We had 2 winning battles here in Tennessee with Fort Donelson and Fort Henry, which is where Grant won. And now we get all the way, they're pushing further down into Tennessee, the Union Army, Pittsburgh landing, or the Battle of Shiloh. If you've heard of Shiloh, that is the same battle. So this particular spot, they have pushed, the Union Army is pushing all the way down here. And they, on the map, it does give Grant the credit. In the first great battle of the war, Grant forces a Confederate withdrawal to Corinth, Mississippi. So Corinth is actually just right below that blue dot that I have here at the top of Mississippi. But they're continuing to push that line, that imaginary line of soldiers that Shadrach had drawn down further into the south. So the Union is doing pretty well. However, even though Grant was in charge, they're saying, and there were some stories about Grant being a big drinker and that maybe he was not quite with it when things were happening, and these other 2 generals kind of took charge. All right, so let's go back to our book though. Here it is. And right below it, Jethro asks, the fighting, it was bad, was it? Ed understood his meaning. Upwards of 20,000, Jeff. More than 12,000 of them was our boys. Jethro looked up at the neighbor thoughtfully. I reckon we'd best not tell Pa, not till we hear from Tom or Eb, because 12,000 boys have probably been killed in this battle on the Union side. Tom and Eb are in that army. It could be them. We don't want to bother Pa. It would be better that way, Turner agreed. You and Jenny can read the papers off to yourselves somewhere. Don't talk about it before your Pa, or your Ma either, for that matter. Pa don't ask about the news these days. That's one way he's so different. Jethro was troubled. How long do you think it might take a letter to get up from Tennessee? He asked after a while. It's bound to take a spell. I wouldn't worry, was I you. You'll be hearing from young Tom or Eb before long. Remember the fight at Donelson was a bad one too, and both the boys came through without a scratch. I don't doubt but what you'll have a letter one of these days. Sure hope so. Jethro turned slowly back toward his team. His thin shoulders stooped a little. He did not weigh more than 80 pounds. Ed Turner must have been sharply aware of the look of frailty about the boy in contrast to the great plow horses and the wide fields where Matt with his 4 boys and Shadrach Yale had worked only the year before. His eyes were troubled as he made ready to drive on. Now, spell yourself every hour or so, Jeff. Don't drive too hard. I'm going to send one of my boys over to help you before long, and some of the men over toward Hidalgo, they allow to give you a day's work now and again. Your Pa's got plenty friends around here in spite of all the workmen's and their kind in the county. So there's a lot of people willing to help Matt Creighton out. So that they know that he's sick. It's only Jethro doing the work. A lot of people willing to come help. One afternoon later in the week, Jenny had hurried with her housework and was prepared to go back to the field with her brother. One of us can take a furrow or so while the other one rests. We'll save each other a sight of weary aching by day's end, she told her mother. Ellen nodded without speaking. She watched them as they walked off to the field together and then turned slowly back to sit beside her husband. They're good young'uns, Matt, she said. He cried very easily in his weakness. I've been thinking of young Tom, he said after a moment. I know. I think of him too, him and all the others. We'll be hearing from some of them soon. You're not to fret, Matt. We mustn't give trouble a shape before it throws its shatter, meaning its shadow. Before we can see the shadow, let's not stress over it. He closed his eyes and did not answer. He was suddenly old and weak, not himself anymore, but rational enough to know that several troubles had already thrown their shadows. Out in the field, Jethro and his sister were able to escape for a while from the gloom of the cabin. April was in full bloom, and they were young enough to accept the sunlight and color of a new spring as omens of good fortune. They liked being together, and in the early afternoon, before he grew too tired, Jethro would walk along with Jenny when she took her turn at the plow, preferring conversation to solitary rest. I can't quite see how they're calling it a victory, he said, his eyes fixed on the ground as they walked along the furrow. If we got down to Corinth and pushed the Rebs out, that would have been good news. This way looks to me like all we'd done was keep the Rebs from having a victory. Anyway, we held on, Jeff. They can't say that our boys was puny alongside theirs like they said about us last year at Bull Run. What I wonder about, though, Jenny, is why Grant wouldn't have known that the Rebs was fixing to attack. I think about it over and over. Why didn't he be more careful? Are you going against Grant like all the papers, Jeff? No, I ain't. Things went against him. Buell was late in getting more soldiers to him. That Wallace feller got himself lost in the woods right when Grant needed him bad. If things had happened a little different, maybe the papers would be singing a different tune about Grant. They're saying now that the president ought to fire him. I wonder why it is that folks are so ready to be down on Grant. Even Shad wasn't exactly for him the way most folks was after Donaldson. I don't doubt that it's because of that awful name, Ulysses. You know the name I like, Jeff? Don Carlos Buell. If I have a little boy, I am going to name him Don Carlos. Jethro looked at her with mingled astonishment and disapproval. Jenny, sometimes you are so foolish, I'm surprised that Shad ever took a liking to you. Jenny produced deep dimples in her hot cheeks. You and Shad are much alike, Jeff. Too sober and solemn for your own good. So there's the comparison. They're both sober and solemn for their own good. Sometimes you make me think you are a little old man in a boy's body. You and Shad, both of you, here's a second reason, both of you need a foolish girl around to jolt the corners of your mouths into a grin once in a while. He was pleased to be compared to Shad, and he walked for a while in silence as he thought it over. Then Jenny spoke again, and he was surprised at the change in her voice. I'm thinking about the battle too, Jeff, and the boys, and maybe Bill on the other side. There's lots of thoughts deep inside me. I ain't just as foolish as I seem sometimes. I know it, he said gruffly. They worked together often during the following weeks. Ed Turner's oldest boy came over to help every few days. And during 1 week, 3 men from neighboring farms came over and put in a day's work. Jethro appreciated their help, but he was always glad when it was Jenny who went with him to the field and talked of one thing and another and sometimes made him laugh. The difference in their ages seemed to have narrowed that spring, and subtly he stepped out of the role of a petted little brother and became a peer of Jenny, with the full rights of teasing or criticizing that had belonged to Tom a year ago. But Jethro was to experience one attack of childish fury before the transition to his new standing was fully accomplished. It happened with the arrival of a letter from Shadrach Yale, and it was very painful. The day had been, up until the noon hour, one of more optimism than they had known for that month. Matt was much better, well enough to come to the table that noon and to listen with interest as Jenny and Jethro told him about the progress of the farm work. Ellen's face was full of relief, and she had stopped long enough in the midst of washing, cooking, and weeding her garden to gather a bunch of lilacs from the hedge and to place them in a small stone jar at Matt's plate. Jenny and Jethro were cheerful as they made their plans for the afternoon. She, with the help of Ed Turner, would finish the planting in the field south of Walnut Hill. Jethro would go on with the plowing down at John's place by himself. They ate with the hearty appetites of youth and health and accepted with satisfaction the few quiet words of praise that Matt had for them. That praise in itself was something new. Matt had always demanded hard work from his children. It was a duty imposed upon them by necessity and by a pioneer philosophy. And praise was neither given nor expected. And the necessity was greater than ever. But a changed man imposed the labor. The older children of the family would have been surprised, and according to their several natures, pleased or outraged by their father's consideration of these two younger ones. Israel Thomas brought the letter from Hidalgo, while the family still sat at the table. Jethro ran out to the road to take it, to report his father's improvement and the state of the farm work in general. Israel handed the letter over with a marked lack of enthusiasm. "Hoped I'd be bringing your pa a letter from young Tom," he said sourly. "This here's probably nothing more than some sweet talk for Jenny from the schoolmaster. Well, here 'tis. Tell her not to believe more than half of what is written it." Jethro took the letter inside and handed it to Jenny with a big smile. It was addressed to her, of course, but that didn't matter. He settled down happily to wait his turn reading it. There had been other letters from Shadrach since he left in February, but as if determined to obey Matt's ultimatum of no romance with 15-year-old Jenny, the young soldier had addressed himself to the entire family. Spring, however, had reached a training camp outside Philadelphia, and it was as soft and gentle as the spring that had settled over southern Illinois. Perhaps some mood of defiance for his future father-in-law had welled up in his heart of a lonely boy. At all events, this was a love letter, and it was for Jenny. When his sister left the table and ran off to her room with the letter, Jethro was irritated, but tolerant of her rights. However, when she returned with flaming cheeks and began to read a few excerpts from the closely written pages, he was dismayed. He wanted to study every line, every flourish of the beloved hand. He wanted desperately to know every word that had been traced by Shadrach's pen. Letters were so few, and on every other occasion that Jethro could remember, any letter received by one member of the family had been read and discussed by every other member. That was courtesy, common decency, whatever one wished to call it. And now came this one, as precious a letter as had ever been received, and there was Jenny reading a line here and there, pausing to blush and most obviously skip over an entire paragraph, sometimes flipping over a whole page without sharing a single word. Tell Jeff, I take great pride and pleasure in hearing of his study of the newspapers. Blushes and a sudden stop. Then again, when I remember the long hours of my illness with typhoid and the loving care with which your mother watched over me, I feel that I do indeed have a mother who replaces the one I lost as a child. And it is my fervent hope, dear Jenny. It was soon evident that she was not going to read Shadrach's fervent hope aloud, and Jethro, full of hot anger toward her, was amazed that his parents were tranquil and undisturbed. They even glanced at one another and smiled a little. Jethro had no smiles, not in his heart or mind or on his lips. I would as soon eat something wonderful good in front of her and just offer her a crumb, he thought bitterly. He set his lips firmly together and got out of the room as soon as possible. It helped a little to have hard work facing him. He harnessed his team and rode away toward John's place without glancing back to wave goodbye to Jenny. He was in no mood to be gracious to anyone, much less Jenny. His rage stayed with him for a while as he walked behind the horses, back and forth along the length of the field. She ain't never been selfish before, he thought, as he rehearsed Jenny's fall from his favor. Then, remembering a lesson from Ross Milton's book, which he and Jenny had been studying together when they had a little time, he tried fitting his angry thoughts into better English. She's never been selfish before, he amended, and some of his anger was dissipated before the satisfaction of his new learning. In the middle of the afternoon, Nancy came down to the field with her children and waited for Jethro in the shade of a big oak tree just inside the fence row. "We brought you a little something to lighten your work, Jeth," she said in her quiet way. She held in one hand a slice of freshly baked white bread spread with butter, and in the other a stone jug filled with cold milk. He threw the lines over the post and sat down in the shade of the tree. The children came and sat close to him. He had paid more attention to them lately, knowing that it pleased Nancy, and they had grown fond of him. "They take you for a man full growed, Jeth," Nancy said, smiling. "I wouldn't doubt but what they said something of John about you." He took a long, appreciative drink from the milk jug. "This is real nice, Nancy," he said, wiping his mouth and nodding to her. He was more at ease with her lately. She was beginning to seem more like one of the family. Her eyes were big in her thin face. "Has there been any letter up at your place, Jeth?" "Just one from Shad. Nobody gets to read it except Jenny." His voice was curt. Nancy watched his face thoughtfully. "He's still in training, I reckon. Him nor John wouldn't be in the fighting yet, would they?" He offered a bite of bread and butter to each of the children. It would be just as pleasing to him, he thought, if she questioned him no further about Shad's letter. He ate the rest of the white bread soberly and watched his two young nephews run a little way down the furrow, their small white feet pretty against the brown waves of freshly plowed earth that lay sleek and glistening in the sunlight. It was April again. April. Jethro liked the sound of the word. He thought how beautiful it would sound in poetry. "Did ever you think how nice the word April sounds, Nancy?" he asked after a while. She smiled a little. "It does have a nice sound, Jeth. April's always been my month, the month of my bornin', the month of my marryin'. But now," she sighed and turned toward Jethro earnestly. "In your studying with Shad, did you ever hear of this place, Shiloh?" He shook his head. "It's no town, I guess, just a little church near Pittsburgh Landing that got caught up in the midst of all the fighting." Nancy was like his mother, he thought. One couldn't tempt her away from the sadness within her. "I couldn't sleep after I read the papers Jenny brought me. I kept thinking of the two young boys and Bill and of John being in battles later on. I thought the night was going to go on forever." She broke off suddenly and sat looking out across the quiet field, her hands folded in her lap. "What do you suppose it was like, Jeth?" He shook his head. "It must have seemed like the end of the world had come," he said soberly. "For thousands it had, hadn't it?" He nodded and felt ashamed that his anger over Shad's letter had made him forget the battle and the thousands of boys lying on the ground at a place called Shiloh. Ed Turner had said, "You can't expect to hear from the boys for a while, Jeth. Think what a job it's going to be to clear the battleground." Jethro pushed the thoughts back in his mind. He didn't want to talk to Nancy about things like that. He knew that it was time to be getting back to work. But when he started to get up, Nancy stopped him with a quick gesture. "Sit a minute longer, Jeth. There's something I feel bound to say to you." He looked at her with surprise. "What's this thing that's on your mind?" he asked, settling back comfortably against the tree trunk and looking up at small segments of sky that appeared here and there through the canopy of green leaves. Nancy hesitated, and when she finally spoke, her words came slowly, as if she were feeling her way with caution. "You mustn't hold it against little Jenny that she keeps her letter to herself. Jeth, a letter is kind of a close thing. It's somebody's words that are writ only for you. It's like you're being unfair to someone you love if you let his words be read by others when he writ them only for you." Jethro frowned and stared at the blue patches above him without comment. "Sometime you'll know what I mean," Nancy continued. "Likely there's some little gal, maybe not one not yet born, that will write to you someday, and every word she writes will be yours. You'll feel that you can't bring yourself to share them words because they won't belong to anyone but you." Jethro shifted his position uneasily. He picked up a small stone and heaved it into the woods in front of him. "I doubt that," he muttered. "I don't care nothing about any girl." "When you was 6, I guess you'd have doubted that soon you'd be managing a team and plow by yourself. I guess you'd have doubted that by the time you was 10, you'd be working to put food in the mouths of your brother's little ones. Ain't that so, Jeth?" "I reckon." She placed her hand on his knee for a second. "I'd best let you get to your work and go back to my own," she said. She called the children and got slowly to her feet. "John used to want me to talk more to folks around me. It was hard for me to do it then. Now, seems when I find myself someone to talk to, it's all I can do to make myself go back to the stillness." Jethro was exhausted that night. Jenny came out of the barn lot when she saw him dragging home with the tired team. That's where we're going to stop for today because I think I'm pushing it towards half an hour and I don't want to spend more than that in one day. So tomorrow we'll continue chapter 6 and the rest of the questions. Have a good day.